Everyone was hunched over. Everyone was bending over in the cold air, their fists invisible. Somewhere, a mule made a pitiful sound. It is known that the cries of animals carrying heavy loads will not subside. Look down and you'll find broken branches, shoe studs scattered along the path, and occasionally some belts discarded by people because they can't afford them. Len Ainstream historical fact slipped in like frost under the door. It is not uncommon for troops to cross mountains in winter. Charlemagne crossed the Alps in 773. Hannibal used elephants long before him, and later the army of the Holy Roman Empire also attempted the same feat. Chronicles often marvel at their bravery, but at the same time complain about their madness, for survival is more like a daily battle than an enemy. When your feet sink into the snow shell, you think of a peculiar phenomenon. It still makes you smile. Some soldiers stuff small pieces of garlic or onions into their boots, believing that the smell alone can prevent chilblains. Imagine the fragrance emanating from a group of men who are drenched in sweat and have toes as long as garlic. This is almost ridiculous. However, when you are in despair, superstition becomes reality. The path has narrowed. You hear the hissing of the wind passing through the pine trees, bending their shoulders until the branches break. On your right, a cliff is shrouded in thick fog, making one feel as if they were in another world. The creaking of your boots was so loud that you stood in a row trying to be like the person in front of you. Historians remain puzzled as to whether these winter marches were well-considered strategies or rash, ambitious gambles. Are commanders really weighing supply charts on risk analyzers, or are pride and a sense of urgency forcing them to throw themselves into the snowstorm? The reason why the debate persists is that the materials in the diaries of monastery scribes or soldiers often exaggerate the facts. A monk might say that the snow is as deep as the chest, but in fact it kisses the knees. But then again, a week of snow reaching up to the knees feels like snow reaching up to the chest, doesn't it? You stop and listen. Your breathing was very loud in the scarf around your mouth. The smell of wool and old sweat lingers on your tongue. Ahead, the commander raised his hand and the procession came to a halt. You stomp your feet to keep the blood circulating. But with each stomp, a stream of powder spurts out, just like the flour in a baker's sack. The soldier beside you whispered something about saints protecting believers. Nod your head not because you believe, but because believing is warmth and you are willing to accept anything. Night fell, the torches flickered, and the flames shrank in the gusts of wind. You huddled together, rubbing your shoulders, and the heat from your bodies gathered like contraband. In the darkness, you hear a mule stumble, a curse in a language you don't understand, and the deep sounds of a group of people rolling down the slope. Supplies have been lost forever, snowflakes sting your eyelashes. You will be distracted. Do you remember the fields in summer with barley swaying and bees buzzing? Then reality slapped you in the face, a cold air nass with a slight smell of pine wood and ashes. There is no summer here, only steady progress, step by step through the frozen pass. The column moved again, and the torches wove along the ridge like in stars. You followed behind, so tired that you couldn't ask any questions, and so cold that you didn't care. But you're still here, still walking. The mountains, ancient and still, silently watch over you. The ground beneath your feet is as hard as iron. With every step you take, your calves will vibrate and your bones will creak on the frozen soil. You stepped on your heel and heard the faint sound of frost cracking beneath the leather sole. If you are lucky enough to have a pair of boots, they will be very hard, mended with wool shards, and might even be stuffed with straw to prevent the cold from penetrating. Many people in this group were not so lucky. They wore worn-out shoes or rags with bare feet. As time went by, their toes quietly turned black. You drag your feet, realizing that shoes are the first battlefield. It is not charming. There are no glittering sword battles or heroic charges. Instead, it is a slow war between flesh and frost. In chronicles of medieval campaigns, The scribe described a man taking off his boots only to find his toes hardened like candles. Frostbite snatched them away before their spears could catch them. This is a straightforward and mainstream fact. The soldiers even lost the battle before they could see the opposing army because their own feet were frozen stiff. There is another strange little detail that lingers like rumors about the camp, with animal fat believing that the fat can keep them warm. That smell must be very disgusting. With every step, there was a stinky smell of lard, but it might have worked, at least enough to keep some toes stuck until spring. The line of march stretches forward. At first the snowflakes fell lazily, and then, as the wind blew, they stung your eyes. You tightened your shoelaces, knowing that a loose knot might mean your boots would slip off and be swallowed up by the white marks in an instant. You've heard of the entire pair of shoes being lost, swallowed up by the sand like coins and never to be found again. Another mule came, its hooves rubbing back and forth on a piece of frozen soil. You notice that the road itself seems to be full of danger, with stones hidden under the snow and frozen areas as smooth as glass. Every step is a gamble. Once you slip, the team won't stop for you. You imagine falling, rolling into the fog, your boots and body disappearing, but it's just another rumor. Historians are still debating whether medieval armies really had standardized winter footwear, or if they were made temporarily at that time. Some sources insist that the military was provided with thick boots lined with felt or wool, while others believe that most men simply wrapped any fabric they had around their ankles. Depending on wealth, supply chains, and sheer luck, the truth can be confusing. Of course, commanders who write reports often skip the boring foot pain and prefer dramatic battles. You stepped on the ground, listening to the hollow echoes around you. The men, wrapped in scarves and hoods, moaned softly. The voice was very rhythmic, almost like a hymn. Flint repeated. In the quiet moments between gusts of wind, it turned into the music of a march. It's not the sound of drums, nor the sound of horns, but just a weary tapping of the soul on the frozen earth. This smell is unforgettable. The wool was soaked through with sweat, the leather cracked from the cold, and somewhere nearby, the faint smell of horse dung solidified into ice. It's strange that even filth can bring peace of mind. This means that life is still here, and this column of pillars has not yet been completely occupied by silence. You are trying to distract yourself. Perhaps you will think of home, of the warm floor and the soft blanket under your feet. Perhaps you are wondering if this mountain path feels warm in summer and if there is moss growing at the place where you are tripping now. But when the wind blows past your ankles, this thought vanishes. You pulled your boots tighter, and the pain in your blood circulation made it hard for you to breathe. The king suddenly came to a halt. The man dragged his feet and muttered to himself. "Lunch does not refrain me," and pulled a comrade up. The sole of his boots cracked, slapping like a broken tongue. The soldier wanted to laugh, but his voice suddenly turned into a cough. He tied it together with ropes, each knot a prayer, hoping it could last for another day. At that moment, you understood that boots are more than just shoes. They are the thin shield between soldiers and oblivion. The world may worship flags and swords, but in mountainous areas both the starting point and the end point of survival are leather wrapped around the toes. Click it again. Your legs are cold. Ahead this line is moving. A faltering and exhausted procession. Every step is a battle. Every time it strikes the frozen earth. This reminds us that sometimes the greatest enemy is just the land beneath your feet. You took out a piece of bread from your backpack, looking forward to relief. But when your teeth sink, you will be shocked. It won't bend, won't soften, and won't crack as easily as bread. On the contrary, it creaks like a stone. The bread you've been carrying since yesterday has turned into a hard weapon, enough to scratch your knuckles. It cannot be used as food unless it is coaxed with fire or steam. No matter what, you still chew at the risk of your teeth breaking, because hunger is stronger than comfort. This is no exaggeration. Chroniclers of the Crusades and the Alpine Campaign all wrote that rations became frozen bricks, bread, bacon, and beans. Once the temperature dropped sharply, Every item that maintained the army turned into inedible chunks. This is the mainstream fact. Soldiers spend as much energy on softening food as they do on consuming it. Soak the bread in water, hide the meat close to the body to keep warm, and even crush the cookies into scalding snow. Every trick is important. There is still a strange little rumor circulating in some soldiers' letters. It is said that when men march, they place small breads under their armpits, hoping that the body heat can soften them so that they can be chewed. Imagine this absurd scene. A row of cold miners' blooded warriors held bread around their waists, like secret pets, giving off a faint smell of yeast and sweat. It is not entirely glorious, but hunger rarely leaves room for dignity. The pillar moves slowly. Keep gnawing. The bread is very hard and the grains are very sharp on your tongue. You close your eyes and imagine the fresh bread you brought from home, the steaming hot crust and the crackling sound of the oven. But when you open your eyes again, all you see is snow stretching ahead and people's faces clenched by hunger. Historians are still questioning whether supply officials really anticipated the severity of the cold in the mountains. Some people believe that the planners underestimated the freezing point of basic rations, thinking that salty foods can resist frost. Others claim that the commanders knew the soldiers could tolerate it and were just taking a gamble. The truth might lie in this chaotic space, where poor logistics and blind ambition are intertwined. In any case, the result is the same. The crispy bread, the trembling soldiers, every bite dampened morale. The soldier beside you curses his ration. He smashed it with the handle of his knife and scattered breadcrumbs on the snow. He scooped some into his mouth, and the rest drifted away with the wind. The pain on his face was not merely due to hunger. This is despair, calmly realizing that the tools for survival were working against him. Also be distorted. He feels that repulsive emptiness spreading like a cold fire. Smoke rose somewhere ahead. The campfire was coa-wed by those who desperately wanted to boil the snow, soften the beans and make at least edible broth. The faint smell of smoke, cruel yet comforting, foretells warmth but reminds you that you still have a long way to go. Your teeth are hurting from overwork. You stuff the remaining bread back into your backpack. Perhaps by evening, as long as there is enough body temperature and patience, it will give in. Before that, you march, your stomach echoes with empty roars, and your thoughts wander to feasts that have never existed. The creaking of snow under the boots echoes the crunching of bread in the mouth. Both feel endless. Both feelings are like punishment. But you keep chewing, because the other option is worse. In this frozen mountain pass, even the food has turned into stone. You must find a way to eat it, otherwise you will fall into the silence buried by the snow. Now the wind has become cunning, circling around your hood and sliding its cold fingers over your neck. Just thinking of that hardened hard loaf of bread makes your stomach ache, and you find yourself staring at that simple white patch around you. Snow was everywhere beneath my feet, piling up on the windowsill and sticking to the branches like stubborn wool. This is both a curse and a redemption, for when food runs out, snow is the only soup left. You crouched beside the campfire, with the men huddled together, their outstretched hands like withered flowers. Someone placed a jar with a dent on the flame. Inside, snowflakes hissed and crumbled into water, and steam rose gently, as if reluctant to leave. The result was a bowl of thin and tasteless soup, like melted snow, with a small piece of vegetable or dried meat floating inside. However, it is very hot. Among these mountains, hot liquid is the closest you can hope for. This is an obvious mainstream fact. Marching troops often rely on melting snow for cooking and drinking water. Chroniclers described the night when the water source froze, forcing soldiers to grab the snow by hand. The fire burned very low, not because of a lack of wood, but because the green logs struggled in the damp air with more smoke than fire. Eating is not so much about nutrition as it is a ritual, an act that convinces the body that it has eaten. Here's a quirky gossip that will cheer you up in the dark. Sometimes, soldiers would throw small pieces of leather scraped off their old belts or saddles into the soup to add substance to it. Boiling softens the leather into something like noodles. Probably not. But when the sound of hunger is louder than the wind, you will chew on anything that gives in. Although the smoke pricks your eyes, The crackling sound of the flames brings peace of mind. The pot was swaying and tilting. You watched a soldier stir with a stick, being very careful not to spill the precious liquid. It has a faint earthy smell, like boiled tree bark. You stretched out your wooden cup, your hands trembling with cold and impatience, and finally took a sip. This liquid will burn your tongue but warm your chest. For a moment, the pain in your heart subsided. Scholars remain puzzled by the frequency with which the military carries appropriate cooking supplies during winter campaigns. Some people believe that commanders give priority to pots and pans that are crucial to morale and survival. Some people also claimed that the soldiers made them temporarily with helmets, shields, and even hollowed minus-out stones. The evidence is incomplete. The truth might scatter like the flickering embers in the camp, each shining briefly before vanishing into the darkness. By your side, people whispered. Men make jokes about this soup, calling it no stew or white soup. A burst of laughter reverberated among the crowd, faint but genuine, proving that even mockery is better than despair. The neiging of horses came from the side. Their breathing was as hazy as smoke in the firelight. The night was getting darker and darker. You moved closer to the fire, holding the cup with both hands, and the steam soaked your eyelashes. You will realize that the insignificant ritual of putting snow into soup is more than just food. This is a kind of resistance. Mountains can take away warmth, comfort, and sleep, but they won't take away the will to eat, no matter how thin the food is. When the flame went out, he took the last sip of the broth and licked the rim of the cup to see if there was any spilled broth. It will snow here again tomorrow. Tomorrow you will pick more, cook more, and sip more. Just have one cup at a time and you can survive the cold silence. When you woke up, you heard the fabric breaking in the wind, and the canvas of the tent was taut like a sail in a storm. Before you even got up, the cold needle pricked your skin. Instinctively, you pull your cloak tighter, trying to tuck your chin into something like something warm. However, these levels are never enough. Wool scratches your neck. The linen wetland is pressed against your chest. The wind still slips through every crack like a thief. Medieval soldiers survived in groups. The mainstream fact is that the military layers wool, linen, and any fur shards they can find, turning themselves into walking bundles of cloth. The cloak has a dual function at night and can be used as bedding. Even finger gloves are rarely seen, some men have to put the sleeves on their hands. Monks and knights all recorded the pain of never feeling dry, because after the snow melted on the fabric, it would only refreeze into hard ice blocks. Then there is the charm with strange little details hidden between the fabric layers. Rebus' anecdote came from a traveler's record. Sometimes men would pin parchment with sacred prayers directly onto their corset, believing that the sacred words could protect them better than wool. Some people even tied red strings around their wrists. It is believed among the common people that color itself can prevent frostbite. Lunch does not refresh hearing. Faith is insulating material. You changed your position and felt the seams of the corset against your frozen skin. Each layer has its own flavor. The oily smell of flaxseed oil extracted from wool. Slight mold on linen that has not been dried for a long time. The smell of smoke from the campfire last night. When people crowded into the tents, the mixed smell became strong enough to smell a cloud of human flesh, strangely reassuring you. Historians are still debating just how standardized winter clothing is. Some chronicles show that commanders distributed a large number of woolen cloaks, boots, and gloves in major battles. Others, however, believe that this is more of a fantasy than a fact. They point out that wealthy knights may own luxury goods, but ordinary infantrymen rely on patches, borrowed or stolen clothes. The debate still exists, just like the soldiers' clothes, sewn together, uneven and full of gaps, but somehow maintaining their shape. As the parade continues, you will notice ritualistic gestures. The men pulled the cloaks around their necks, prayed in low voices, and adjusted their belts to make the fabric cozier to their skin. Someone beside you sneezed into the sleeve and then pulled it back onto his numb finger without hesitation. Every layer is very important. Every piece of waste is precious. The wind blew even harder. The snow fell on your shoulder, stuck to the little pearl, melted, sunk through, and immediately froze again. You feel like a walking ice wheel, but you still keep moving forward. Every step is cushioned by your clothes. Without it, you know you can only hold on for a few minutes, or even less. Somewhere behind you, a man is praying to Saint Martin, the patron saint of soldiers, who once cut his cloak in half and gave it to a beggar. The story floats in the dialogue like smoke, reminding people that even a tattered half-minus cloak is worth saving a life. Pull your cloak closer and stroke the edge where the silk thread isn't eyed with your fingers. It makes people feel vulnerable and inadequate. But among these mountains, faith and wool are the only barriers between you and silence. Marching is no longer just about your legs. It weighs on your back, on your shoulders, and on the thin string of patience in your heart. Before you saw it, you heard the sound of scraping. The sleds were dragged on the ice and snow, pulled by animals, whose breaths in the thin air gave off steam like small bonfires. You turned your head and saw them. The donkey's ears were nailed to the back, the cow's mouth and nose were covered with frost, and the mule was swaying under a load that seemed heavier than a mountain. The mainstream fact here was very simple. In the Middle Ages, armies relied on pack animals and draft sleds to transport supplies, because the wheels were no longer useful. It was almost impossible to have carriages at the mountain pass, so the army tied their equipment to wood and drove wild beasts through the snow. There would be no bread, no arrows, no firewood, and no hope of going on. The life and death of the entire battle depended on the indomitable endurance of these creatures that had never voluntarily joined the battle. You will see a mule pulling a wooden sled piled high with sacks, struggling to pull the harnesses, with its hooves slipping. The noise is too terrifying. The groans of ropes, the shrill cries of wood scraping ice, and the throats of animals protesting. The soldiers pushed their way from behind, muttering rhythmically. Their breaths formed small clouds, which soon vanished. The scene was slow and had almost no end. Push, slide, curse, push again. However, in the midst of hardships and difficulties, some strange little stories emerged. A bizarre behind the minus scene story whispers through the chronicle. Sometimes soldiers would whisper incantations in the ears of their beasts, believing that kind or sacred words would give them strength. Others were not so gentle. They swore that singing and energy in front of animals would make them walk faster, as if human laughter had brought tenacious joy to the mules. You can almost imagine the absurdity of it. An army climbed up a mountain. The soldiers sang vulgar verses loudly, trying to coax a donkey forward in the snow. The slope has become steeper. People do not use ropes to tie sleds to animals. Their boots were rubbing against the ice. You smell a pungent sweat odor mixed with a cold metallic smell. A belt break, the goods roll to the side and grains spilled on the snow. The grains of wheat are scattered like golden stars against the white background. People, disregarding the frost, did their bare fingers and rushed to scoop them out, for each one was of great significance. You will see a soldier licking his palm to collect scattered grains and greedily sucking them down before they get lost. The road narrowed and there was a panic among the crowd. This path is right next to a cliff, making it almost impossible for people and mules to walk on it at the same time. As long as it missteps, this animal will fall into the abyss below. You can hear people shouting and the ropes creaking as they secure the sleds. The mule froze, its eyes wide open and its nostrils wide open. This kind of fear is contagious. You feel your chest tighten and your feet take root, as if you too would be dragged off a cliff. Historians are still debating whether commanders really calculated the risks of transporting supplies in this way, or made every choice out of desperation. Some people believe that the leaders made careful plans, drew the routes and arranged the warehouses in advance. Others, however, believe that they are merely gambling, believing that there will be enough animals surviving to transport the necessary supplies. The sources of information are contradictory. Monks who write letters from distant monasteries have little knowledge of the daily struggles on these passages. Lunch does not refresh you with Bismuth Enetwain. The plan on the parchment is shattered by wind and snow every day. The mule finally staggered forward. The soldiers held the rope to steady it, just like a human army composed of rain. The sled creaked past the narrowest part, and people heaved a sigh of relief. You breathe again, not realizing that you have been holding your breath all along. For a moment, you might wonder how many lives each stubborn hoovy and each creaking wooden board depends on. The sun, weak and pale, broke through the clouds and illuminated the scene with a ghostly light. You see steam rising from the backs of the animals. Their fur has been ground white, their eyes are dull, but they are still moving forward. You want to know how many people will fall tonight. Some will be eaten. Countless cruel fact from countless elections. When the supplies were exhausted, the desperate soldiers slaughtered their beasts and exchanged their means of transportation for meat. The bones were left in the snow, silently witnessing the rule of hunger. But now, the column is still going on. Are ruthless. Hoofs hit the ice, sleds made a shrill sound, people purred, ropes creaked, and curses flew everywhere. You smell the stench of feces, which is pungent and spicy, surprisingly at ease in the sterile cold. This means that life is still tightly attached to this frozen passage, no matter how tragic it is. The path briefly flattened down, followed by a strange sense of tranquility. People fell onto the sleds and patted their animals, as if they were gay. A soldier took out a carrot from his pocket, which might have been stolen or saved, and gave it to a mule. The animal's lips trembled and their teeth creaked gratefully. You look at this tiny moment of kindness, which is an oasis in the difficult desert. Then you realize something. Survival here is not merely a matter of men's patience. It's also about animals, reluctant to be conscripted into a war they had never chosen. Their stubborn hearts, steady hooves, and endless ugs make marching possible. Without them, the army would just be empty, minus-handed, starving civilians. You adjusted the strap of your backpack and suddenly felt its weight more acutely. Your boots creaked forward, in sync with the mule beside you. Humans and wild beasts trudged together in the snow. It is not merely bound together by ropes, but by the common need to move forward. The frozen peaks rose higher and higher, with sleds dragging behind them like anchors. You want to know how many ridges there are ahead. Before the advent of the army, how many animals would still be tripped up? But now, the column is moving, and that's the most important thing. This mountain gives people a kind feeling in winter. Sometimes the river water rises uncontrollably in summer, freezing into hardened, glittering roads. You will find yourself now standing in front of someone whose surface is as smooth as glass, extending into the distance, like a mirror placed on the land. The army hesitated on the riverbank. Everyone was staring at that piece of ice, wondering if it could bear the weight of thousands of people, or if it would crack into a black death. The records of this period describe these traversals interwoven with on fear. The Chronicle of the Alpine Campaign tells us that when bridges collapsed or did not exist at all, the entire column was marching on the frozen river. Walking on ice is both a rescue and a gamble. There was no carriage stuck in the mud. There was no surging sea water to sweep people away instead. There was an unpredictable ocean with every step groaning. Here comes an impressive and strange phrase. Sometimes soldiers would spread hay or straw on the ice surface, thinking that it would hold them more firmly under their boots and sleds. Just imagine how absurd this is. An army spread out the river surface like a banquet hall, dragging their feet along a golden path that crackled beneath their feet. The horses were blindfolded to keep calm, and when their hooves touched the frozen ground, their ears nervously quivered. You drag your feet forward in the dew. Your breathing makes the air murky, and your ears are filled with the strange music of ice. It squeaks, crackles and groans like a living creature beneath you. Every sound made your heart pound. You stared fixedly at the soldier in front of you, imitating his movements exactly the same, unwilling to take a wrong step and take the risk. Where the snow was blown away, patches of ice sparkled, revealing the depth of darkness, seemingly bottomless. Modern historians are far from unanimous in their views on just how safe these border crossings were. Some people believe that the commanders carefully arranged the time and chose nights, with extremely low temperatures for several consecutive weeks to ensure that the ground could bear the load. Others, however, believe that this is mainly blind luck. Despair drives people to jump into the river regardless of its thickness. Prayer is more important than measurement. These records do not provide exact information, only sporadic descriptions, and occasionally some people die in the tragedy of ice cracks. A carriage staggered onto the river with its wheels wrapped in rawhide strips for a firm grip. The people on the sled screamed, and the metal collided with the frozen stones on the shore, sending sparks flying everywhere. Once on the ice, the entire vehicle can easily skid, and people struggle with ropes to align it. It will slide to one side. The mule pulling its taggart, its hoofs slipping off, and its eyes wide open in fear. A soldier ran forward and whispered to it, as if soothing a child and guiding every step. The animal was trembling violently, but somehow it kept moving. Your own boot slipped and your leg was shaken. You spread your arms wide and regained your balance at the last second. The taste of fear filled your mouth, metallic and sharp, as if you had bitten your own tongue. All around you, silence is heavy. Only those strange brutes beneath your feet break the silence. Even the winds seemed to have quieted down, unwilling to disturb the gambling. Halfway through, you look up and see this line stretching endlessly from front to back. The tiny figure marches solemnly, each step a test of trust on the frozen surface. The torches on the riverbank were flickering, their flames blurred by a thin mist, as if the whole world had held its breath. Suddenly, a crackling sound, as sharp as a rifle shot, echoed in the valley. People froze stiff, animals screeched, and ropes twitched. You feel the ice beneath your feet sinking. Panic seizes your chest. But the crack is very small, on the side. Warning rather than judgment. But its speed slowed down. Everyone's steps quickened, and every whisper of prayer became even more passionate. Finally, the distant riverbank appears before you. Men tripped over the soil. Some kissed the ground while others fell down due to exhaustion. You followed behind, your boots banging on the frozen ground, and your legs were shivering with cold. Behind you, the river sparkles in the moonlight, leaving a silver scar in the mountains. This time it spared your life, although you knew others weren't so lucky. And the creaking sound was still ringing in your ears. This feeling doesn't seem like you've crossed a river, but more like you've walked over the back of some ancient beast, holding your breath beneath the ice. You get up before dawn. At this time, the world is quiet and white. You realize that the silence is not empty. It was filled with smoke. The fine traces rising from dozens of campfires were woven in the sky like ghostly flags. Before you smell the ash, you can first taste its flavor, which is spicy and dry in your throat. The army survived another night, and those small smoke columns were the evidence. Chroniclers often comment on this kind of night ritual. Fire means warmth, food and the chance for the body to escape from the cold. The soldiers formed a circle, their faces shining orange against the backdrop of the snow. The rest of the world was plunged into darkness. For an army that has crossed mountains and rivers, these sporadic sparks are not merely consolation. Without heat, fingers become stiff, lungs freeze, and sleep becomes fatal. There are even stranger notes kept in letters and stories. One strange practice mentioned is that soldiers sometimes put stones directly into the fire and then wrapped them in cloth to use as a warm stove on the bed. Others vowed to sleep as close to the embers as possible, even though it meant waking up with their cloaks scorched and coughing from the smoke. Imagine that when you are dozing off, your nose is filled with the smell of charred wool, but you are grateful because at least you can still feel your toes. You slowly approach one of the fires. The flames crackled hungrily. Sparks flew into the darkness like tiny meteors. This wood smokes more than it burns. The green branches broke from the sparse trees above the hedge. The smoke stung your eyes. You blinked your eyes and felt the tears freeze on your eyelashes. Around you, people are half asleep and half awake, nodding their heads and stretching their hands stiffly towards the firelight. The sound weakened. The crackling fire, the quiet breathing sound, and the faint rustling of clothes when someone changed to keep warm. There is still a divergence of opinions in the academic circle on how the military manages the supply of firewood in areas covered by heavy snow. Some people think that the commanders trained a collection team and sent people to collect fuel at the front. Others believe that most armies simply burned everything they find, even demolishing wooden shrines or village fences. Although the evidence is insufficient, every claim irrefutably proves one point. Morale collapses even faster than the temperature. You clenched your hands, feeling the warmth seeping into your bones, a slow relief that almost made you sigh. Your cloak now smells of smoke, and the scent seeps into the fabric until it becomes a part of you. After the parade, it will last for a long time, reminding people of the nights when cigarettes were as precious as bread. Not far away, a group of people began to hum softly. It's not a song but a low hum, the kind that matches the rhythm of the flames. This is not for entertainment. This is for endurance. This kind of sound can prevent excessive drooping of the eyelids, prevent men from falling into an endless slumber. The buzzing sound and the frames together wove a fragile barrier, blocking the silence of the mountains. Then, all of a sudden, the wind direction changed. Thick smoke billowed towards your face, choking your eyes and throat. With a cough, you turned the world into a blurry expanse of white and grey. For a moment, it felt as if I had drowned on land. The person beside you chuckled hoarsely and murmured, "Tonight, the cigarette has chosen you as its sacrifice." Even here, humor seeps in like another kind of warmth, stubborn yet humanized. When dawn finally rose, smoke enveloped the valley like a thin veil, marking miles of military passage in all directions. There is no doubt that the enemy scouts can see it, but the risk is acceptable. It is better to live another day in the warm fire than to be invisible in the darkness. As the commotion in the camp and the fire were put out, you inhaled the last lung filled with smoke. It sticks to you, shrill but strangely comforting. The memory of this night will not remain in scenes or sounds, but in wood, wood and the bitter smell of survival. The road wound its way up again, and fatigue spread throughout the group like a chronic disease. The face was pale, the lips were chapped, and the body beneath the cape was stiff from the frost. Then, with almost no hint, the voice began very low, whispering in the wind, and then expanded into a rhythm. The soldiers are singing. Writers of that time often recorded this habit. When the army marched on difficult terrain, it was accompanied by the rhythm of chanting or singing. This is not about melody, not about beauty, but about survival. This rhythm gave the tired feet a reason to keep raising, step by step. Repeated words can drown out hunger, cold and even fear. You can imagine it as a version of music played in a gym during the Middle Ages. Apart from here, the gym is a snow-covered cliff, and missing one step could mean death. Under coercion, human creativity can also undergo peculiar changes. Some reports mentioned impromptu verses created during the march, where people ridiculed their commanders or joked that freezing in someone else's war was absurd. Imagine wrecking through the snow, loudly imitating church hymns while converting sacred verses into vulgar humor, making the entire document burst into laughter. This strange semi-minus rebellious chorus might be the only spark of rebellion that can be safely emitted. This sound forms around umbicos between the ridges. The heavy snow drowned out most of the noise, but the singing was strangely leaping in the silent air. Rubbing against the ground, the clicking sound of a kettle rhythmically swinging from someone's bag. The melody is uneven and sometimes there are coughing sounds, but it can stand the test. For a few minutes you forgot that your toes were numb because the sound excited you. Scholars are not entirely in agreement on whether commanders encourage this practice or tolerate it grudgingly. Some people believe that singing is regarded as a necessary condition for maintaining order, where people unite in breathing and rhythm. Others suspect that although the police do not approve of these disrespectful lyrics, they turn a blind eye because they know that silence is more dangerous than mockery. The facts, as always, are blurred between regulation and reality. Your own voice joined in almost without hesitation. The lyrics are very simple, repeating about reaching the valley, about the warmth and fine wine waiting somewhere ahead. The melody is plain, but it gives a good feeling of breathing shape rather than the mist around you. The volume grew louder until the entire pillar sounded like a wild beast roaring in the cold. Next comes the strangest part. You realize that this song is not just sung for you. The animals pricked up their ears upon hearing the noise and moved more steadily, as if soothed by the human chorus. Even the mountains seem to have responded. Rhythm pushes away the silence and fills the empty air with life. You notice that a smile spread across the soldier's face beside you. His teeth were yellow and his cheeks were cracked by the wind, but his smile looked very genuine. He stomped his boots in time, spread his arms wide, and risked being crushed by the snow. During a short stretch of the journey, laughter and joy intermingled with singing, and the column almost felt like a parade rather than a death march. The path became winding again and the singing was intermittent. Shortened breathing, the verses turned into gasps. But the echoes lingered on, drifting back to the valley like memories. You realize that music has already played a role. People walked another mile but didn't notice the pain. The singing might ring out again tomorrow. Perhaps dark jokes, perhaps holy tones. But tonight, a tenacious voice echoes in your ears, a voice resisting the cold. The snow was creaking down again. But in your chest cavity, the rhythm still continues. Every step is in harmony with the intangible drumbeat of survival. You expect the taste of a glass of ale to make you feel comfortable, just like flames sliding down your throat, stabilizing your courage. But in this deep mountain, even the flowing hope will betray you. The wooden barrel is frozen. The foams and lidified into a paste. What is poured into your cup is no longer a drink, but something semi-minus frozen, more like porridge than beer. The records of the Middle Ages undoubtedly show that wine was transported with the army. It is safer than water and can provide heat and boost morale. Ordinary soldiers drink beer and malt liquor. Officers and wealthier knights drink wine. And sometimes I drink too, if luck and resources permit. The wooden barrel is a companion. However, at the Alpine Pass, the cold has turned it into a laughingstock. The men were pounding the wooden barrels with axes, trying to break the ice and scoop out a handful of slush to stick to their tongues. There are also some strange little details. Some soldiers wrote that they put hot stones into cups to heat up the beer. Obviously, the result was a bubbling smoked beer, with a flavor somewhere between bread and charred wood. Imagine curling up beside a campfire, sipping a liquid like a chimney, but feeling grateful no matter what, because it's warm. Now you place your cup in the cradle and gently shake it. The ale inside is very strong, just like half-minus cooked syrup. The cold current on your teeth will wake you up. The taste is faint and dull due to freezing, but its memory is sufficient. Around you, men also raise their glasses, half-minus heartedly raising them. The impact was very low, with wood hitting wood instead of bright metal. But posture is very important. The question of exactly how many troops rely on alcohol remains unsolved among scholars. Some people believe that beverages are indispensable, distributed in fixed quantities every day, and are the lifeline of morale and health. Others countered that the supply of materials was too unstable and soldiers often did not have it but relied on melting snow or thin meat broth. The truth may vary due to campaigns, wealth, or chance, but sometimes it rolls faithfully. At other times they were frozen or fell into the canyon, leaving only dry mouths and longing. You glanced at the man beside you. Their cheeks were rosy, not because of warmth, but because they had drunk for a short while. Laughter rose upwards, gentler than the snowflakes landing on the cloak. A person told a joke about a bishop slipping on the ice. Another person sang a song from the tavern, his voice muffled but provocative. For a moment, this procession didn't feel much like a parade, but more like a tavern with white walls and dark clouds hanging from the ceiling. But probation is short minus lived. The wind blew in, scattering the laughter. Your ale has turned into a smoothie before you finish half of it. You swallowed the rest and your teeth ache from the cold. The bitter and plain taste lingered on, but neither did that sense of comfort. It faintly reminded one of the fireplace and the feast of life far from this mountain path. The fire gradually died out, and the wooden barrels were frozen stiff. You know, tomorrow they will be heavier and harder to pry open, but they will still keep moving forward. Even frozen malt liquor is the hope in the barrel, and hope is not something you have abandoned by the mountain. The night is getting darker and darker. You lay down, still holding a cup in your hand, with a faint taste of smoothie lingering on your tongue. Silence returned, with only the sound of breathing and the occasional drowsy laughter breaking it. Tonight, the semi-frozen and semi-liquid malt liquor has already played its role. The snow is falling even harder. The thick curtains swallowed up the distance and blurred the boundary between heaven and earth. You walked forward with your head down and your eyes half-closed. Suddenly, a sound pierced through the storm, a deep, resonant explosion that shook more in your chest than in your ears. One corner. In such weather, medieval armies relied on sound as their lifeline. The description at that time stated that when vision was lost, horns, compass and even drums were all used as signals. In a snowstorm, flags would vanish into the white mist, shouts would be swallowed up by the wind just a few feet away, and long wailing notes were often the only orders that soldiers could hear. It means moving forward, reorganizing, or preparing for trouble. Without it, people scattered in all directions and froze alone in the snow. There is another description of the Swiss election campaign that leaves a strange image. Some horns were carved from ox horns, or wooden were so rough that they froze onto the performer's lips. Imagine that a soldier pulls the instrument away, only tearing the skin in his mouth. The blood instantly solidifies and he has to blow again under the commander's instructions. There was a cruel joke circulating in the team. A person who blew the horn would leave behind his own fragments every time he blew it. The storm almost swallowed everything. Your boots are creaking, but around you is a white wall of silence. The horn sounded again, and now it was even closer. People instinctively walked towards it, just like moths attracted by flames. You raised your head to look for the banner, but there was no movement on the snow. Only the notes guide you, empty and majestic, telling you where the pillar bends. Scholars still have differences of opinion on exactly how effective these sound signals are in mountain storms. Some people believe that the horn is indispensable. They have noticed that the chronicles have mentioned many times that the horn summoned people in chaos. Others, however, believe that this kind of sound often confuses rather than helps, emitting strange echoes on the cliff, to the extent that soldiers take the wrong path. There is no conclusive evidence, it is merely a chaotic glance described by a weary scribe with shaky ink. The explosion came again, this time long and low. You feel it vibrating in your chest, stabilizing your steps. The person beside you covered his ear with his hand, trying hard to figure out its direction. The other one prayed to Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music, as if the sacred harmony could also guide him onto the right path. You can imagine the horn blower himself, hunched over the strong wind, his cheeks bulging with rage and his fingers frozen on the wood. Each note is like lifting a mountain, but without it, the army would drift away like snowflakes with the wind. Then, faintly but truly, you heard the second sound. A response horn came from somewhere ahead, reverberating through the mountain pass, calling and responding, weaving a sound line in the storm, binding the army together with an invisible breath line. The parade is still ongoing. You follow the sound step by step until your legs are sore and your ears are buzzing. The horn is not music, nor is it beauty. But in this endless white silence, it is the thing closest to the heartbeat of life. That's enough for tonight. But a new threat came with the dawn, and that was the strong light. The world has turned into a dazzling white. Every surface reflects the pale sunlight, until it feels as if a knife of light has pierced your eyes. You blinked hard, and tears froze on your eyelashes. You realized that you couldn't keep your eyes open for a long time without feeling pain. Snow blindness, an invisible enemy, has no weapons or roars. The records of that time emphasize this danger. Historians point out that soldiers complained of eye pain, blurred vision and sometimes even complete temporary blindness after marching on the bright snow for several days. For most people, this is not permanent. But in the winter campaign, even a few hours of blindness can mean falling off a cliff or being left behind. Commanders fear this pain is like the fear of chilblains. For an army without eyes is an army that cannot march. Then there is the strange intelligence and wit in men. In some scattered reports, an unusual technique has emerged: rubbing charcoal, or soot around the eyes to reduce glare. It must look very strange. Rows of exhausted soldiers had black stripes all over their faces, just like war paint, not for fighting but to keep walking without going blind. It is said that some people cut narrow cracks in leather strips to reduce the light to controllable strips, which were the primitive ancestors of snow wearers. Now raise your hand, rub the edge of the campfire with your thumb, and pick up a piece of soot to rub along your cheekbone. The gravel scratched your skin, but it relieved immediately. You can open your eyes a little wider. The world around you is no longer a dazzling wall of light. Others did the same, their faces turning into stained masks, making the column look more like a group of shadows than an army. Modern researchers hold different opinions on just how widespread these protective measures are. Some people believe that this is a common folk remedy passed down by local guides or shepherds who know the mountains. Others, however, consider these to be rare impromptu performances that are not often mentioned, as most soldiers merely suffered from irreparable pain. The truth remains uncertain, just like footprints erased by fresh snow. The parade is still ongoing, but at least for now you can see it. The ice is not so dazzling anymore. The road ahead is clearer. You will notice the details that you overlooked before. The cracks on the permafrost, the faint blue glow of the distant glacier. The shadow of the crow was circling overhead. Even in times of difficulty, the world has its fragile and beautiful moments, which can only be glimpsed when the pain is alleviated. A soldier beside you joked feebly. Your eyes are covered with cigarette ash, and you look like demons coming out of the mountain. Another reply said that demons would be warmer. A burst of laughter filled the air, and the dark face grinned, showing its teeth in the strong light. A few beats of the heart and the pain will become easy. The sun continued to rise higher and higher, and its rays remained undiminished. You squinted your eyes, peering through the soot-streaked mask, and your boots creaked forward, feeling grateful for this little survival skill. Without it, this mountain would blind you. With it, you can at least keep moving forward, keeping your eyes wide open and looking ahead at the endless white road. The valley lies dormant beneath its snow blanket, but silence is fragile. You move forward with the team. When the ground beneath your feet trembles, your boots make a squeaking sound on the hard snow. At first you think it's just your own exhaustion, a mistake, a heartbeat. But then, the mountain itself is groaning. A deep rolling sound reverberated in the air, and every soldier instinctively froze. The air suddenly became pungent, filled with a panicked metallic smell. Look up. The snow-covered hillside above is moving. Avalanches are nightmares beyond the control of commanders. The record of the times gives us an unforgettable glimpse of the entire army being swallowed up by a howling snowfall. It is not the enemy's arrows nor hunger, but the mountains shaking their burdens and burying people, just like erasing ink from the pages of a book. The army fears avalanches as much as they fear ambushes, because neither warnings nor skills can guarantee survival. One moment you were moving forward, and the next you vanished, suffocating in the silence. Then came the strange little stories passed on by the soldiers. Some people think that whistling can cause slippage, so even when they are nervous they will keep their mouths tightly closed. Others held small bells, not to ring but to keep silent. The superstitious belief is that hanging a bell can calm the mountains, just as snow can calm an angry soul. Imagine an army with bells stuffed in their capes, striding forward with difficulty. This is a kind of charm to resist the temper of nature. Strange, but when your life relies on superstition, even absurd rituals will seem reasonable. The crack above was getting deeper and deeper, making a sound like being torn apart by an invisible hand. Then it began. The snow spread, first sliding like a whisper, then in a rush, and finally forming a wall. The white rage rushed down the slope, devouring the trees and huge rocks along the way. You felt the earth shaking, the air being stirred up in a chaotic manner, and the roar was so loud that it drowned out your own pulse. People instinctively fled in all directions, diving into the sparse shelters of the rocks and pressing themselves down on the frozen ground, as if only in this way could they be saved. Historians are still debating the frequency of avalanches encountered by medieval armies. Some chronicles vividly describe them, insisting that the entire campaign was interrupted by a disaster. Others remained silent on this topic, leading modern readers to wonder whether the scribe exaggerated or omitted these stories to maintain their reputation. The sources are scattered and inconsistent, leaving us with problems rather than certainty. Did the avalanche destroy the entire regiment? Or are they rare tragedies magnified by rumors? We may never know. Though, with snow biting your cheek. A roaring sound surged past, and in an instant, the place that was still silent turned into a white river. Its wind comes at you alone, knocking your breath off your chest. When it finally vanished, silence returned the way more terrifying than noise. You raise your head and hear tinnitus. The slope where the column marched is now blank, smooth, whitened, has been erased. The shouts of the survivors echoed through the crowd. People dug the snow with their bare hands, screaming the names of those swallowed by the mountains as they dug. The fingers were bleeding and the nails were racking. But the snow was merciless, as hard as stone beneath its surface. Occasionally, a fragment of a cloak, a frozen arm, and a twisted sled would appear. Some people were still alive when they were rescued, panting heavily and half-blind, while others would never be found. The cold made them wake up faster than their comrades could dig. You leaned on your heel, panting, gazing at the white land that had turned into a cemetery. The air was filled with the smell of pine trees split by the slide, sharp and roaring. Your body trembles not just because of the cold, but because you know that nothing, not skills, not courage, not belief, can protect you from the avalanche of sudden inspirations. And people obey. However, the march must continue. The commander raised his arm and ordered the column to advance along a safer ridge. The soldiers looked back, then looked again, and continued their trek, leaving behind buried corpses. You feel guilty, like a stone in your insides, but there's also a strange numbness needed to survive. If you stop, you'll freeze stiff, and the snow hides its death in the silence. That night, the camp was quieter than usual. The fire burns low. The men huddled together in silence, each gazing at the flames as if they could see the faces reflected there. The smell of smoke grew stronger and stuck to the cloak and hair. But even such comfort cannot erase the memory of the roar. Somewhere in the distance, another avalanche rumbled, faint but real. Raise your head, tense your shoulders, and then let them hang down again. That mountain reminds you that it is still listening. However, even here, some small rituals still exist. A soldier beside you is whispering a spell, with a bone amulet sandwiched between his palms. Another peasant tied a small piece of red cloth to a branch and stuck it in the snow, just like a flag to defend against disasters. You should realize that avalanches take away more than just lives. It deeply engraved superstition in the hearts of every survivor. The next morning, as the team continued to move forward, the road was surprisingly smooth. Where people died, the snow stretched on and on, as if mocking memories. You carefully put on your boots, and with each step you took, you whispered to the ground to stand firm. On the mountain peaks, they are faintly visible, silent and indifferent. Their white shoulders bear the heavy load that has not yet fallen. Now you understand why medieval soldiers regarded mountains as places of ghosts, places of sacred judgment, and places of anger in white robes. Their breath floats before you, blending with the wisps of mist rising from the slope. Somewhere behind, buried under several yards of snow, work comrades minus and minus arms, mules and all the supplies. The road ahead stretches on, uncertain and dangerous. You march because you have no choice. The mountains never cease, and the living never cease. The marching procession continued to advance in the eerie silence, their boots streeting on the newly fallen snow, which concealed the terror of yesterday. But soon you'll discover something terrifying, not in the wind, but by the side of the path. A dark shadow half-minus buried against a white background. When you got closer, you found it was a frozen corpse with its arms curled up, as if it were still holding a weapon. His face was as pale as stone, his mouth wide open, and he screamed endlessly. He has become a marker, a warning to all those who follow. The records of that era did not omit such details. The chronicles of the monastery, traveled Armies, and even letters sent home all mention how the deceased were arranged at Yamaguchi. The soldiers who remained became landmarks, ruthlessly reminding people of the cost of moving forward. The tour guide pointed at the corpse as a signpost. Follow the man in the red cloak. A frozen horse marks a safer slope. This sounds strange, but in the endless snow, a corpse might mean the difference between losing track and finding refuge. There are also strange customs among the soldiers. Some people think that if you step directly on a frozen corpse, your feet will be frostbitten. So people awkwardly walk around the corpse, bowing slightly as if apologizing. Others placed some small tokens, slices of bread, a button, a prayer bead on the chest of the deceased. This was a temporary offering to soothe the mountain. Imagine an army passing through the graves of their comrades, turning every frozen corpse into a signpost and a shrine. The smell slowly approaches you, weak yet sharp. It wasn't decay because it was well preserved due to the cold, but something metallic. The air was filled with the smell of iron. It mixes with the smoke from the nearby fire, and an unsettling perfume pierces your nostrils. You pull the cloak tighter, as if the fabric could block out that smell, although it lingered in memory more than air. Modern researchers are divided over the true intentions of these body markers. Some people believe that the military deliberately left the dead where they fell because they knew others would follow and need guidance. Others, however, consider this necessary rather than a strategy. People just lack the power to bury the dead in the permafrost. In any case, the icy and snowy world has become a part of the road itself, a silent companion to those who are still breathing. You keep walking, but the scenes are everywhere now. A mule was stiff on its side, its harness still tied, and a hand stretched out from the drift, as if a root was grasping the sky. A frosted helmet with a skeleton baring its teeth and mocking a living person on top. Every time your vision erodes you until you are left with nothing but numbness. The stone pillar slowed down at a particularly narrow rock ridge. It was snowing heavily here, blocking the path. The guide hesitated for a moment, scanned the slope, and then pointed to a half-minus exposed black lump near a rock. This is another corpse. This one is kneeling, as if praying, motionless. The tour guide confidently gestured to it. This is the correct method. Without that mark, you would realize that this path could only be guessed, perhaps death. Even in silence, the deceased is leading you forward. At night, people whispered by the fire about what they had seen and heard. One person insisted that when they passed by, he saw a cold face smiling. It was a trick of lighting, but it was enough to send shivers down one's chills. Another person swore that when you looked back, there were fewer corpses, as if the mountains had gathered them together when you weren't paying attention. Jokes kept coming out, thin and bitter. At least the deceased never complained about the rations or blisters. But the laughter soon died away, for you thought that tomorrow you might become one of the statues by the roadside. Sleep is disturbing. When you close your eyes, you will once again see those pale figures, their outlines shining in the darkness of memory. You dream of walking through an endless corridor, filled with frozen figures, each slowly turning their head to watch you pass by. You woke up with a start. The fire was low and the night was silent. For a moment, you're not sure if you're dreaming. Dawn came, pale and pitiful. You keep trekking along this line and then realize that this mountain has its own record of progress. Not on parchment, not on ink, but on frozen flesh. After the song fades and the flag rots for a long time, the corpse will be locked in ice until spring, or forever. They are both memories and warnings engraved on the road. Now, your gaze keeps moving forward, unwilling to linger on the shape at the edge of your line of sight. But you know they are right there, lined up on both sides of the road like silent sentries. With every step you take, you get closer to the possibility that one day, you might also stand in eternal watchful, guiding others through long after your voice has vanished. The mountain seems empty, but you soon realize that you are not alone. Ahead, a figure emerged from the fog, wrapped in a rough woolen cloak and leaning against a shepherd's staff. He looks just like any villager who trudges home. But the soldiers all froze, their hands tightly grasping their weapons. In such terrain, strangers are far more than just strangers. They are guides, spies, or threats, and sometimes all three. The literature of medieval battles often mentions the locals encountered on the highlands. Sometimes they would offer assistance, leading the army through safe paths in exchange for coins or food. At other times they mislead the entire column, leading the soldiers to ambushes or dead ends. These experiences are like a gamble, as dangerous as an avalanche or frostbite. You rely on someone who knows the mountains better than you do, but you can never be sure for whom his loyalty will serve. There are still some minor quirks in the side notes of the chronicle. His story describes as a spy who disguises himself as an innocent shepherd, driving a flock of goats ahead to show his innocence. Another story tells of a woman selling hot milk to frozen soldiers and then disappearing the next day. Rumors spread that she had handed over the intelligence along with her airy farm to the enemy. A person with a heart of stone, clutching a milk cup, unknowingly sows the seeds of his downfall. You approached and carefully examined the person in the snow. His beard was covered with frost. Despite the bad weather, his eyes were sharp. He muttered to himself in a dialect that you could hardly understand, pointing at a ridge. You glanced at the commander, who quickly weighed your options. So orders must be followed. The boots creaked into a new path. Trust and fear are intertwined like a rope. When you walk behind a stranger, the scent of him still lingers on. Sheep, smoke and unwashed wool. In the barren cold, he felt a strange comfort. He walked freely, treading on the shallowest snow and tapping the hidden rocks with his cane. The men imitated his every move, both grateful and vigilant. None of them spoke too loudly, as if afraid that he might accidentally hear an idea. Modern historians still disagree on exactly how many times the locals have truly served as guides rather than fraudsters. Some people believe that the actual survival makes the village's loyalty unstable, and they will help the person who offers the highest price. Others insist that these communities are strongly inclined to defend their territory and take advantage of foreign troops with false information. Facts may vary from valley to valley. Day after day, survival determines loyalty, not politics. Several hours passed and the guide stopped at the fork in the road between the two slopes. He made a gesture in one direction, murmured something, and then vanished into the fog without even waiting to express his gratitude. The army stared at his footprints until the wind wiped them away. Suspect thorns. Is he saving you or at the mercy of fate? Only the next mile can prove it. This road is getting narrower and narrower. The cliff yawns beside you. You can feel the ripples of fear. The men turned their heads and glanced at the place where the stranger had disappeared. Some people cursed in low voices. Others prayed in low voices. When your life depends on a man you met just a few minutes ago, you will realize how fragile trust is. The story spread like sparks. A soldier swore that the guide's cloak had the color of the enemy. Another person insisted that he had seen a silver coin change hands between him and the commander. The truth is distorted in retelling until no one is sure whether they have been saved or betrayed. You were awakened lying down, staring at the smoke rising gently from the crack of the tent door. The faces of shepherds, milk sellers, and hazy locals flash through your mind. They are the ghosts of the past, emerging and vanishing, always holding your life in their hands. You want to know how many troops have fallen into the trap in this way before you and how many have safely escaped by trusting the right strangers. The wind rustled the canvas. You closed your eyes, feeling uneasy. Tomorrow you will walk again. I don't know if the next invisible person on the road will be redemption, deception, or both. Dawn came. It was fragile and gloomy, and the column stirred slowly and reluctantly. Men coughed while covering their cloaks, their boots squeaked on the hard snow, and somewhere in the fog, a priest cleared his throat. You know what's going to happen next because you've been hearing about it every day since the parade began. The sacred objects and flags slowly unfurled. The chroniclers of this era recorded this ceremony with almost the same reverence as they recorded the battles before entering the unknown white world. Soldiers gathered behind symbols of faith, fragments of the true cross, the remains of nameless saints, or flags embroidered with icons. These items are not merely decorations. They are the shields of the soul, ensuring that the divine grace accompanies the army step by step. Without them, morale would wither as rapidly as toes in frost. However, in these solemn moments, even stranger details are woven. A source said that a bishop was carrying a cumbersome carriage and needed people to drag it with sleds, which slowed down the column but never gave up. Another rumor holds that soldiers sometimes wear amulets which are made by grinding the bones of saints and mixing them into wet. They believe this can warm their blood. Imagine dragging your heavy feet up an icy slope with your knees bent, yet refusing to throw away a box of finger bones because you believe it can keep you away from death. The priest raised one hand and the procession stopped. A small altar was temporarily built with a flat rock, Ryokor wise placed on top of it. A glittering box inlaid with gemstones can capture the faint light passing through the storm. The pungent aroma counteracts the smell of sweat and damp wool. The soldiers lowered their heads. Some people prayed in low voices, while others simply closed their eyes and rested. Modern scholars do not fully agree with the real role these cultural relics have played. Some historians believe that they were at the core of discipline, binding people to higher causes when rationing and wages failed. Others, however, consider them to be more symbolic and cherished by a few, but to a large extent, they are ignored by exhausted soldiers. The evidence is scattered and sometimes it is an effusive description of miracles. At other times, silence seems as if the ruins are merely a burden. It is certain that the commanders took them along, whether they believed it or not, because giving them up would be like blasphemy and carry the danger of mutiny. The chanting of scriptures has begun. A low voice reverberated over the telephone line, blending with the hissing sound of falling snow. The Latin words you could hardly understand echoed in your ears, and their rhythm stabilized your breathing. For a moment, the bone-ninous chilling cold loosened its grip. You feel not only wrapped in wool, but also in an intangible belief, vulnerable yet worn. At the end of the ceremony, the banner was raised. The saints depicted in the painting swayed stiffly in the wind. Despite the storm, their faces remained serene. Under the gaze of the icon, the soldiers straightened their shoulders. You'll be able to sense the change immediately. The pillar moved again, faster and more steadily, as if the sacred object itself had endowed it with power. But faith is to minus way. Later by the fireplace you heard whispers saying that today's avalanche was a punishment for the skeptics. Others claim that the light of the sacred object is even brighter, proving that redemption is approaching. The leaf shapes memory, transforming the pain of a day into a narrative. This mountain is no longer just covered with snow and stones. This is a theater where saints and sinners contend in silence. The night is deepening. In the camp, the cultural relics were placed in the center and carefully guarded. People slept in a circle, as if these objects were giving off warmth in the darkness. In notice a soldier passing his lips against the door frame, closing his eyes and showing extreme trust before lying down. Another person had a small wooden cross tied to his wrist and held onto it tightly even when sleeping. You lay down, smoke curling up, gazing at the blurry outline of the sacred box that was faintly glowing in the firelight. Is this protection or waiting? Does it protect the military or wear it down? You can't say it, but you know it. When the mountains seem to be burying people, people need some faith. Whether it is fabric bones or softly chanted hymns, faith is the only flame that never freezes. Walk with you, silent yet eternal. Their gem-minus like eyes gaze upon you, watching you step into the white hall again. The march is very long. Every time you take a breath, the air becomes sharper and cuts your throat. People are coughing around you their sounds, and some are spitting red fragments into the snow. Cold is like an unwelcome tenant, settling in their lungs and refusing to leave. It wasn't a sword or an arrow that attacked you first. This is the slow pain of the disease, a slow fever burning beneath layers of ice. The records of medieval armies mention this continuous battle against diseases, until they bled. Damp causes pain, crunches in the lungs and becomes fatal in the thin air. The shortage of supplies and the cold have turned even minor diseases into serious threats. The commander might talk about the enemy's city walls and glory, but the soldiers remember the true face of winter. and movement against one's own body, and then you happen to discover a strange note hidden in the work of a missionary who accompanies a mountain march. He said that he described people chewing on the bitter root Minus angelicus and ensis minus dug from the frozen earth. The locals say that this plant can relieve coughing and warm the blood. Others, however, overlook the bark of pine trees, believing that the resin carries strength from the trees themselves. Imagine rows of soldiers, their faces blackened by soot to protect their eyes, squatting on the snow like children searching for weeds, stuffing fiber root into their mouths, because they have no other way to try. You kneel in the snow yourself, your fingers numb, because you are scraping soil under the rocks. The roots you pulled out are filamentous and have a faint smell of pepper and earth. You took a bite, and the bitterness surged up on your tongue, spicy enough to make your eyes well up with tears. But warmth followed, whether real or imagined, and you kept chewing. Others do the same, desperately believing that nature hides medicine in the frost. Today's scholars are debating just how effective these remedial measures are. Some people believe that angelicus and ensis and rosin do offer nutritional or mild preservative qualities. Others, however, consider this a folk tale and believe that these plants have almost no use except to divert people's attention. Evidence is scattered among half-minded believing anecdotes, leading modern people to wonder whether tree roots really saved lives or merely brought hope in places where it seemed hopeless. The column marched with difficulty, and everyone was coughing, chewing and praying in a low voice. When the roots were cooked into a thin stew at night, the smell of the roots mixed with the smoke, turning the camp into a strange pharmacy. Its taste was very bitter and almost medicinal, but the men gratefully sipped it, warming their hands around the cup as if they had grasped a treasure. You will notice that in this eerie environment, one small ritual after another is blooming. A soldier always chews 3 times before swallowing, believing that this can reduce his fever. Another person insists that the root must face east, towards the sunrise, otherwise it will lose its strength. These postures come at no cost, but they weave a net with faith in daily life, binding people together and becoming a fragile shield against despair. In the evening, the sound of coughing echoed in the tent, and the quacking of the lungs even drowned out the cracking of the fire. You lie awake and do lying down, listening, counting your breaths, amid the panting of the person beside you. The air was filled with the smell of damp wool, pine smoke and bitter tree roots, heady enough to press into your dreams. In those dreams, the mountains seemed to breathe with you. Exhale the frost, inhale the warmth, and decide who will wake up in the early morning. Morning still came. The man climbed slowly, his shoulders bent, but he was still climbing. A pot of stewed roots was simmering over coal, giving off a thin layer of steam. You took a sip. She made a funny face at the smell, but was grateful for the heat emanating from her chest. After a while, the cough lessened, the pain subsided, and you felt you had enough strength to take another step. The parade is still ongoing. Now every creaking of the boots is accompanied by the rustling of tree roots being stuffed into the belt, as well as the faint chewing sound of people walking. The mountains show no mercy, but you have stolen small prescriptions from their soil. These bitter gifts may or may not heal. When survival depends on hope, belief itself becomes a good medicine. So there is ash around your eyes, a root in your mouth, and you cough towards the wind. A strange army, more of earth-gatherers than soldiers, is still moving forward and is still alive at present. When you woke up with shoulder pain, it was not only because of the weight of your backpack, but also because of the shackles you had been carrying all along. When you change, you will feel it. Your armor, stiff and cold, clung tightly to you, just like an iron cage that had been forgotten all night. If you pull the tape, it will clump together and the ice will crack along the length of the tape. You should be an armed fighter, but today you feel like nothing more than a statue bound by chains. The written materials of medieval battles make one think clear. Armor is both a life and a curse in the cold. The usually flexible men's rings become stiff when the snow melts and dray melts, locking them in like rusty chains. The board armor turned into a personal refrigerator. Metal absorbs heat from the meat until the skin is burned by frost. The knights who once charged bravely on the battlefield are now staggering and clumsy, fighting against their own equipment rather than the enemy. However, in these records, you also see some strange things about humans. A chronicler described that soldiers stuffed straw between their armor and fillers, not only to keep warm, but also to prevent iron from sticking to their skin. Another article mentioned that men would urinate on their breastplates to melt ice, and then put them back on, smiling wryly at the smell, but feeling happy about the activity. Imagine it. This proud knight did such a humiliating thing to make his armor fit in the cold of the early morning. You pulled your cloak aside and looked at your hand guards. The leather below is very hardened, the rivets are covered with a layer of frost. You put your hand and immediately felt the bite, just like falling into the snow. Every bend of your fingers is slow and delayed, just like a puppet's hand being pulled by a solidified rope around you. Others pat their bodies with their arms and shake their limbs to regain vitality. The sound of metals colliding with each other filled the entire morning, like a terrifying knocking sound. Scholars still have differences of opinion on how effective the armor is in this situation. Some people believe that it still provides the necessary protection and can even block the wind and protect the meat. Others, however, counter that it causes more death than it avoids, and it slows down the soldiers until they freeze or fall. Evidence exists in sporadic remarks. One scribe praised the knight in armor for his tenacity, while another lamented how many had fallen because their own breastplates had turned into ice coffins. The parade is started again. With every step your armor takes, it moans, scratches and grinds, with a cold sound echoing in your ears. Imagine yourself as a living clock with every movement jingling. In the thin air, the weight feels doubled. You envy those poor soldiers who wear patched wool clothes, lighter and more flexible, while you carry a heavy metal bundle and insist on reminding yourself of your military rank. Under the edge of your helmet, snow drifted into the gap between the canyon and your cloak. It melts as soon as it touches and then freezes again. This is an uncomfortable cycle that no gesture can break. Your breath condenses into water droplets inside the sun visor, turning into ice and sticking to your eyelashes and beard. You raised your sun visor to breathe, only to feel the wind stinging your face. There is no victory, only the choice of which kind of pain to endure. At noon, the column stopped beside a pile of rocks. The soldiers pried open their armor with knives and scraped off the frost on it. A soldier placed his helmet on the fire and spun it, like a pot, before daring to press it onto his skull. Another person shook his arms vigorously, muttering curses, and then collapsed on the snow, too tired to walk any further. You watched him fall silent, his curse flickering faintly in the pale sunlight, until others shouted loudly to pull him up. The smell of metals very pungent in your nose, mixed with the smell of smoke and sweat. You licked your lips with your tongue and tasted the iron, as if the armor had seeped into your body. This feeling makes you wonder if the mountain is slowly turning you into a statue of it, with your body hardening into metal and your movement ceasing, until you become a part of its eternal silence. However, there are also some moments of black comedy. The clanging of a soldier was so loud that others joked that he could scare away wolves just by walking. Another person slipped on the ice and landed on his back, unable to stand up until two companions pulled him up like a tilted turtle. Even here, in the midst of pain, laughter briefly emerged, warming the group like a hidden embers. Night fell. You unfasten your armor with your stiff fingers. Each tape has its own battle. The lining below is wet, sour and gives off a musty smell, and frost has already formed on their edges. They will find it harder to wake up in the early morning, but you dare not leave them. Unguarded armor is both a curse and a necessity. Without it, the enemy's arrows would hit you. With it, the cold might take you away first. You lie down and wrap yourself in a cloak that smells of smoke and iron. The stars twinkled slightly above their heads. You wondered if even they would feel sympathetic when they saw the soldiers trapped in their armor. You gradually fall into a restless dream, in which you hear the continuous clinking of metals, as if the iron chain even follows you into rest. You need to put it on again tomorrow. Tomorrow you will march again, like a reluctant statue trudging through the snow. This mountain will test your strength, but your armor will test you even more. However, step by step, you will keep moving forward because stopping means becoming the statue of who you already think you are. The mountain path narrowed again. Before you could see it, you heard the groans of the woods. A carriage was swaying to the side, its wheels frozen stiff and its axles screaming in protest. The mule pulling it slipped on the ice, turned pale with fear and fell into the snow. The men rushed forward, pulling the rope, carrying the goods and cursing in low voices. But the carriage stopped moving. This mountain has taken away another victim. This time it wasn't a single person, but a cumbersome supply skeleton. The materials of this period have described this scene time and again. The carriage was overwhelmed. The animals staggered to death, and the supplies fell into the canyon. When every bump on the road can shatter the wheels, what's the use of a carefully planned inventory? Chroniclers have noticed that even well-made carriages would wobble on steep and cold passes. Finally, the lifeline of the army, minus bread, arrows, tents and tools minus, was held hostage by a terrain more powerful than that of any commander. There are still some strange details that will remain in the mind. A diary tells of the soldiers who, after their carriages broke down, took them apart piece by piece to use as firewood. They preferred warmth to goods. Another one mentioned that when wild beasts fall, their frozen carcasses are cut open for food, and their skins become temporary coverings for those who are too poor to afford cloaks. Imagine that a carriage used for transporting supplies eventually turns into fuel, and the animals pulling it serve as both dinner and blankets. This is a bizarre cycle, but it also proves the creativity of despair. Now you see people unloading sacks from the dilapidated carts and piling them up on the slopes, which make a shrill sound on the ice. Every handful of grains is precious. Not a single one can be wasted, but mules are another matter. It lay on its side, its body undulating up and down, and its hooves trembling. A soldier knelt on the ground, stroking its mouth and nose, speaking softly. You couldn't understand. Then, with a cold efficiency, he drew a knife and slashed it across the throat. The animal twitched and then stopped, with steam swirling in the cold air. Silence fell, heavy and primitive. The smell of blood spread rapidly, and the metallic warmth fought against the sterile cold. People exchanged glances and then looked at the corpses. You saw the calculation in their eyes. When night falls, the meat will be roasted over the fire, thin but still able to last. No one cheered. No one joked. They merely accepted the demand of hunger. Modern historians are divided over whether the military was prepared for this inevitable situation. Some people believe that the commanders fully anticipated the loss of vehicles and livestock, as these vehicles and livestock were carrying emergency supplies for slaughter and reuse. Others, however, believe that these decisions were made only during the crisis and were made on the spur of the moment when the soldiers had no other choice. The truth may change with each campaign. Sometimes it is predictable, but it is often not always tragic. Now the march has begun again. There are fewer carriages and more sleds pulled by tired people. You feel the weight on your shoulders, and the shoulder straps sink deeper and deeper. Without wild beasts, the burden fell on the shoulders of mankind. Every soldier was a warrior and a mule, dragging the army inch by inch on the stones and snow. The creaking of the wheels was replaced by grunts, the dull sound of the rope hitting the palm. The boots creaked under the extra load. You tripped and almost dropped your backpack on the ground, hitting a stone. As your weight increases, the cold as bone and chilling, and sweat freezes on your skin. You turned around and saw the queues stretching behind you. The men bent over, ropes tied into their shoulders, their faces gloomy. It doesn't look much like an army, but more like a group of people in shackles, not bound by law but by need. That night in the camp, people silently remembered the broken carriage, which shards crackled and smoke rose gently, warming the hands. The mule's meat strips hissed on the saliva. The smell is both greasy and pungent. Chew slowly. The taste is very hard but surprisingly pleasant. Hunger can even turn sadness into food. Surrounds the fire. The men exchanged whispers with each other. A person insisted that he saw a ghost wandering where the carriage had fallen. A pale figure watched as the goods were unloaded. Another person swore that the mule's cry would always echo in his ears, louder than any horn. The third person complained that this mountain liked to steal wheels and make the army to crawl like worms rather than roll freely. The laughter that followed was faint, but it carried a sense of contempt. You lie down and gaze at the stars through the gaps in the smoke. The image of that dilapidated car lingered on. The wood was shattered, grains were spilled, and the mule had come to a stop. It feels like a symbol of the parade itself. Heavy load, sudden collapse, severe adaptation. Tomorrow another carriage might fall, another wild beast might be slaughtered. But tomorrow you will still stand up, shouldering a heavy burden. So the mountain taught us a lesson, one wheel at a time. There is nothing that rolls forever here. Every step has been achieved through sweat, sacrifice and loss. However, step by step you keep moving forward. The camp was in an uproar, not because of hunger but because of the light. Far beyond the ridge, wisps of faint smoke rose in the dusk sky. They were not the thin lines of your own fire curling up. The man first noticed curiously, and then felt uneasy. A bonfire always means having company, but in these mountainous areas, company is not welcome. The records at that time emphasized this tense moment. Soldiers often saw wisps of smoke in the distance, not knowing whether they came from their fellow travelers, local shepherds or enemy scouts. Fire reveals its existence, warmth, and position, just like a flag in the daytime. Commanders always face the same predicament. Approach and risk being ambushed, or ignore and risk losing aid. Both of these choices are very important. However, in the blends of the chronicles, you will find some stories that complicate the situation. There is a story about two armies, sworn enemies who camped in the same valley. They were too tired to fight, so they had to stay by the campfire, staring blankly in the snow until dawn, and then continue on their way. Another soldier mentioned that they happened to discover a village feast on the mountain, where the locals welcomed both sides with coins. Their table was filled with bread and cheese as if the war had never touched them. Smoke on the ridge could be a sign of danger or dinner. You are now standing at the edge of the camp, your cape tightly wrapped to keep warm, your eyes fixed on the distant firelight. The wind carried a faint smell, the smoke of wood, perhaps grilled meat, although this might just be your imagination. Around you, people are whispering to each other, guessing who is making a fire. Some held their weapons tighter, others made the sign of the cross on their chests, and all were staring at the horizon as if it would respond. Rafe Amanda paced back and forth, weighing the options. The scouts were dispatched, and their silhouettes vanished into the darkness. The others in the camp waited nervously, their ears pricked up, waiting for any sound other than the crackling of their own flames. Every sound of chopping firewood seemed like a threat. Today's scholars hold different opinions on how the military interprets these smoke signals. Some people believe that they have been trained to interpret the patterns, sizes, rhythms and quantities of shooting as encoded information about the existence of the enemy. Others express doubts about this, considering it a hindsight speculation. For both historians and soldiers, the truth is obscured by distance. The scout finally returned, panting heavily and with wide minus open eyes. Their report is very short. Not an army but a bunch of small houses. The locals huddled together in the cold. Their fire burns for survival. Although doubt still lingered, the entire camp heaved a sigh of relief. Are they harmless farmers or allies of the enemy? A decision must be made before dawn. That night, the fire flickered on the tired face. Some people joke that if they were enemies, at least one fight would make their blood boil. Others, however, complained that the locals might be even worse, with their food prices outrageously high or their betrayal of the military for money. The flames on the mountain ridge burned steadily, indifferent to speculation, as silent as stars. You fell asleep restlessly, dreaming of flames spreading across the mountainside and smoke filling the sky until the stars were obscured. When you wake up, the real feather is still slightly curled in the distance, like an unanswered question. At dawn, the column moved carefully towards the village. The creaking of the snow was louder than usual. Every step was taken with caution, and the weapon was within reach. When the small house came into view, the fire also emerged. It's small and ordinary, used for making stews, not for sending signals. Several villages emerged, wrapped in tattered wool, with weary eyes but no hostility. The team was filled with relief, although pride made people dare not show it. That night, your own campfire burned higher, warmer and brighter. The distant plumes vanished as the smoke mixed with each other. A valley brimming with the atmosphere of shared survival. For at least one night, enemies and friends became blurred, replaced by the universal truth of the winter mountains. Fire means life, and every living person must let it burn. When the army reached the next valley, food was more valuable than gold. The march exhausted the supplies, and the dilapidated carriages left behind took away the little buffer you had. The men chewed on the dander, their fingers trembling from hunger rather than cold. Therefore, when the column accidentally discovered the scattered huts at the foot of the cliff, every soldier's eyes sparkled with desperate hope. Medieval records repeatedly emphasize the importance of local trade during winter marches. The army seldom carries supplies sufficient to sustain itself for a long time. Even the best miners planned battles would assume that they would buy, barter or seize food from the communities along the way. Cheese, dried fish minus whatever the farmers could have in excess, the soldiers would take. In return, they might offer coins, protection or threats under the guise of promises. Survivals has turned the army into restless merchants bargaining in a language they only understand. However, the minor quirks in these encounters are often more vivid than the contract itself. There is a saying that when soldiers exchanged their boots for accommodation, they actually gave all their shoes to others in exchange for spending the night in warm barns. Another one mentioned that a commander paid with salt instead of silver because in the mountainous area, salt was more precious than coins. Imagine taking out a handful of crystals shining like small jewels and looking at a farmer with his eyes wide open in gratitude. You are now standing in the center of the village. Smoke is rising gently from the chimneys, and the faint smell of stewed dishes is wafting through the air. The farmers are gathered wearied, grasping their cloaks in their hands. Their faces have turned pale from fear and hunger. They are no richer than you. Their children peered from the door, their eyes wide open, looking at the armored soldiers covered in frost. You soon realize that this was not a warehouse waiting to be plundered, but a vulnerable community on the verge of survival. The negotiation has begun. The officials stepped forward, spoke through interpreters or gestured with their hands. They offered the coins and the farmer looked at them suspiciously. On these lands, silver means nothing, salt means life, and coins are not as valuable as a bag of grain. Some villagers pointed at the cliff, where goats were chirping softly, exchanging milk for tools or cloth. Others shook their heads, unwilling to give up the little thing they relied on for survival. Historians still disagree on whether these exchanges were more inclined towards cooperation or coercion. Some people believe that the military respects local communities and knows that kindness means reliable supplies. Others, however, believe that soldiers often take away what they need, leaving villagers with nothing. Written materials are unreliable. Commanders prefer to describe generosity, while farmers leave no record of their losses. The truth always lies somewhere between charity and theft. You see a group of soldiers handing over a bundle of salt and getting several rounds of hard cheese in return. This exchange seemed almost like a ritual. The salt grain sparkled in the sunlight, just like a different kind of coin. Another pair of men exchanged the place they lived in the barn with a farmer and promised to protect his goats from wolf attacks at night. That from the despair of mutual need, the air was filled with odors unfamiliar to your tired nose. The steaming fresh milk in the earthenware pot. The barn was piled up with thick hay. The smoke rising from the fireplace mingled with the bitter taste of the snow. For a moment you felt the pain in your stomach ease. A villager forced a piece of bread into your hand. Difficult, insignificant, but real. You chew your food slowly and savor each crumb of bread, wondering in your heart whether this moment of kindness will be remembered by the story or if tomorrow's hunger will erase it. However, this meeting was not without tension. A soldier shouted angrily when he was refused more food. Another person tried to sneak into the barn without permission, but was dragged out by his companion. The line between trade and theft is as fragile as ice. The commander intervened promptly, reminding the soldiers that the army without allies in these mountainous areas had already lost half of its battle. Order was restored, but unease lingered in every look. That night, the camp was much warmer than it was a few days ago. Cheese and milk cycle. The wood used to make the fire was bought from the village. A few lucky people slept on the straw in the barn instead of on the snow. A tentative laugh, the first time in weeks without gritting one's teeth. The villagers watched silently from afar, their own fire faintly glowing. To community share the same valley, connected by needn't, separated by suspicion. When you lie down completely for the first time in a few days, you realize that survival in these passes is not only based on courage and faith, but also on the deals made in the cold. Exchange salt for accommodation, bread for coins, and trust for time. Tomorrow the army will continue to advance, leaving the villagers indifferent in the face of the mountains. But on this night, both the soldiers and the farmers heaved a sigh of relief, feeling warm because of the fragile survival trade. The march continues. Hunger is no longer the only emptiness, nor is it the indifference towards the soldiers. There is another kind of parting, quieter but equally painful. The silence of home. For days, weeks, and months in a row, the soldiers struggled forward in the frozen mountains without any news from their families. The letters they carried, if any, seldom survived the heady snow. The message vanished in the storm, the messenger was lost in the drift, and the paper was damaged by moisture and frost. It seemed as if the mountains themselves had swallowed the sound, making the soldiers wonder if anyone outside these ridges still remembered them. The chronicler incidentally hinted at this gap. The campaigned Irie mentioned the letters sent, but never replied to. The envelope was in wax and handed over to the rider who never returned. A monk recorded that letters from an army were scattered in the wind like snowflakes. In a poetic way, it is acknowledged that most of the words remain unspoken. Official records seldom elaborate on this kind of pain, but from the lines, you can sense that loneliness is interwoven in every cold step. However, in this silence, some peculiar details emerged. Some soldiers, not knowing how to write letters, would carve their names on their shields, or the first letters of their names on tree trunks along the road, as if they could cross distances by carving themselves on the ground. Others imitated the letters and verses, beginning with "My dearest" or "The one I left," singing softly by the campfire, as if the mountains themselves could take the tune home. Imagine a tired man, his face blackened by soot and frost, singing a lullaby, not for his comrades, but for his wife and children hundreds of miles away. You are now sitting by the stove with parchment on your knees and a quill trembling on your frozen fingers. You write very slowly. The ink is thick and sluggish, and there are stains on the characters at the tip of your pen. You start by assuring me that I'm still alive and end with a question you know will never have an answer to. Can they read these lines? Will they receive this letter? Anyway, you still put it away, because writing itself is a kind of comfort, a way to remember that the world beyond the snow still exists. There is a divergence in the academic circle regarding the effectiveness of the medieval military communication system. Some people think that they are surprisingly complex, with relay riders and encoded signals that can keep commanders in touch from a great distance. Others countered that this system collapsed in mountainous areas because the weather and terrain disrupted any contact lines. The truth is hidden in several letters that have survived. Fragments of longing, fragments of strategy, broken sentences suddenly come to a halt, as if the pages themselves are frozen in thought. The men complained about their families. One of them described a child he left behind who could hardly walk, but now must be old enough to run. Another person doubted whether his farm could survive the winter without him. 1/3 of the people admitted, but he could no longer remember his wife's face clearly. Snowflakes and time had blurred his face. Every confession's made in a low voice, for speaking out loudly about absence will lead to despair. You looked up and saw the smoke rising from the fire curling up into the sky, converging with the clouds and mist, and drifting towards the unseen valley. For a moment, you imagined the smoke carrying your thoughts over the ridge, downstream, across the fields, until it reaches your home like a ghostly letter. This might be foolish, but it's no more foolish than an absent child singing or carving names on tree bark. The mountain can devour paper in nights, but it cannot silence memories. It deepens at night. You unfold the parchment again and strike the words on it with your fingers. The ink has been soiled, but the meaning remains. Prove that in this frozen wilderness, you still remember the warmth. Around you, men are clutching fragments of parchment, pendant boxes, and engraving souvenirs, anything that can connect them to non-minus existent sounds. Some people kiss them before going to bed. Some people hid them in cloaks as if they were afraid that the wind would blow them away. The next morning the parade began again, and a letter was tightly stuffed into my heart. Few people can reach their destinations, but the act of writing, believing that there will be readers' actions in the future, will keep you moving forward. The silence of my hometown may last forever, but the echo of hope is louder than the snow. The higher you climb, the thinner the snow becomes, but the road doesn't become clearer. This road is winding and often completely disappears beneath drifting objects or rocky landslides. During the day, you can sometimes follow footprints, the ruts of carriages, or the vague footprints left by predecessors. But when the storm hit, these signs vanished. When the sky darkens and the earth is swallowed up by light, you will find yourself seeking guidance upwards. Medieval records often mention how the land turned to the sky when it betrayed the army. Navigating by stars is not only the responsibility of sailors at sea. Soldiers at mountain passes also rely on constellations to determine their direction when their tracks are unclear. The North Star, firm yet not flickering, is as important to an army as to a commander. Without it, people would have to keep going in circles at risk, consuming precious strength until they were conquered by the mountains. However, apart from the practical utilization of stars, there is also an almost mysterious attachment. Some chronicles described soldiers whispering that constellations deliberately moved, deceiving them and punishing their arrogance. Others swore that Orion's belt pointed out the path to safety, while the Pleiades warned of the approaching storm. Imagine a group of people crowded on a ridge, gazing at the sky you are familiar with today, but believe that each shining dot is either a friend or an enemy. You tilted your head back, and your breathing became blurred in the night. The stars are brighter than you have ever seen, without the obscuring of smoke and city lights. They are so close to you that you can almost touch them. They are so sharp in the dark that they sting your eyes. If you follow these patterns, you know that Ursum Ager bends on the horizon. Cassiopeia resembles a curved throne, with the North Star firmly in the north. For a moment, the world didn't feel so chaotic anymore, as if you were walking on a mat spanning the sky. But this mountain also has its tricks. The clouds slid in quickly, covering the sky until only a few stars twinkled faintly. The men muttered uneasily, some making the sign of the crescent, some cursing. Without the sky, direction suddenly becomes fragile. The canoes slowed down, and each bolt carried heavy hesitation. Historians are still debating how proficient soldiers were in astronomical navigation. Some people think they have received training, at least at the beginner level, and are capable of using the main constellations. Others believe that only a few guides or officers can read the stars, while the majority follow blindly. The existing evidence indicates that both possibilities exist. The order mentioned the night march guided by stars and the anecdote of soldiers wandering desperately when the sky darkened. Around the campfire, stories keep emerging one after another. A soldier claimed that his grandfather taught him to read the sky as if it were a book. Each star has a letter representing a path. Another person insists that the stars are the souls of the deceased, guiding those who are still alive. The debate became intense. The sound grew louder until laughter came. In the midst of hunger and cold, even arguing about the stars becomes a kind of warmth. You are lying on your back on the snow. The cape spreads out beneath you, gazing upwards. The stars move slowly, eternal and indifferent, yet you hold them tightly as if they were a lifeline. You wonder if anyone is looking at the same constellation from afar tonight, depicting the same shape. Perhaps just this idea is enough to transcend distance, a silent message written in the light. Dawn broke and dark clouds gathered. The stars have vanished and hidden away, but their memories remain. You get up, adjust your backpack and walk forward along the line. The road is still uncertain, but knowing there is a map on it, even if it's not visible, will steady your steps. Because on these mountains stars are not merely light. They are anchors of hope, proving that beyond the snow and silence, there is still a pattern, still an order, and still something eternal existing in this world that tries to erase you every day. The path made a sharp turn and you suddenly heard a sound. The wood makes hollow groans under pressure. Ahead lies a bridge, stretching across the canyon like a scar. Its planks were covered with snow and the ropes were stiff from frost. You stopped and stared at this fragile building, wondering how many people it had supported. And the wind howled through it. It was destined that there would be a waterfall that no one could escape. The written records of the winter campaign describe the fear and awe of these leaps. The soldiers recorded how the bridge shook in the storm and how the ice stuck to the rope until it became as hard as iron. Every step seems like a test of fate. For the army transporting supplies and animals, such a transit is simply a nightmare. However, they are inevitable. Without bridges, the entire battle would come to a standstill on the cliff, not defeated by the enemy but by the air. Then, in the blank spaces of the chronicle, you catch a glimpse of the lingering strangeness. A source said that the soldiers crawled on all fours, too scared to walk upright, and their armor jingled like frightened beetles. Another article mentioned that people cover their eyes before stepping on it, believing that seeing the fall is more likely to drive them crazy than the fall itself. Imagine a team of strong soldiers with eyes like children playing games, moving inch by inch on the creaking bridge. You are now standing on the springboard. They stuck together very quickly. The snow creaks under your boots. The voice was hollow and thin. The rope hummed in the wind, vibrating like vertical strings. You hold them tightly. My fingers were numb in the stiff gloves, forcing myself to move forward. Every time you shake it, your stomach will feel uncomfortable. Every moan of the wood echoes in your chest. The air was filled with the smell of resin, mingled with the cold stone and the terrifying metallic odor. Move slowly in columns, one person at a time, and keep a certain distance between each person to reduce the load. Aniel was walking at the door, barking in terror and rolling its eyes. The soldiers held its rope, shouting encouragement and cursing until it finally came forward. Each sound of hooves was loud and clear, and each pulse prolonged the time. The bridge shook even more violently. The sound of the rope grew louder, and you could feel the breath of the pillar being tightly grasped. The academic community has long been debating the frequency with which medieval armies built and discovered these bridges. Some historians believe that engineers in the army built temporary crossing points and tied wooden ropes to the appropriate places. Others, however, believe that they rely on the existing span of the village, and these rough buildings weren't ever intended to span thousands of feet. The records are not clear, only fragments describing canyon passages or dangerous ferry crossings, allowing us to imagine the details filled with streams and prayers. Halfway through, a gust of wind blew across the canyon, tearing apart the cloak and helmet. The bridge was tilted and the cables were trembling. You clutched desperately, your chest pressed against the cold rope, breathing rapidly. A soldier in front slipped and his boots got slippery on the ice. He knelt down on the ground, waving his arms, and the column gasped in unison in an instant, pulled him up and dragged him forward. The bridge held up, but the fear lingered like a shadow. Finally touched the stone again. You staggered to the other side, your knees weak and your hands roaring as you grasped the rope. Behind you, the queue is still dragging, and your figure is swaying like a leaf on a rope. Comfort spreads slowly like melted fingers, fragile and fleeting, yet it is real. That night the campfire was brighter than usual. The men laughed even louder, their voices breaking as their tension was released. Stories about who slipped, who cursed, and who comforted by kissing the wooden board are flying everywhere. Would rather face the enemy's blade than another bridge. The laughter was intermittent and tense, but it warmed the night like a flame. Lying on your back and looking up, you can still feel the bridge swaying in your bones. Memory will not easily leave the brook of wood, the mound of the rope, and the abyss below. You realize that mountains not only fight against known storms, but also against space itself, which enables you to dare to cross places without ground. This road will continue tomorrow. Another ridge, another test. But you can rest in peace tonight. The chasm behind you, the bridge still stands firm. The fierce wind was merciless, tearing at the cloak and pounding the tent, howling like a giant beast that refused to sleep. In such chaos, the orders shouted by the officers vanished in an instant. The soldier 3 steps away only heard the sound of the storm. However, the column must move. In the mountains stretching for miles, there must be some way to unite people. This approach does not come from language but from a more primitive sound linus, a steady drumbeat. Records of various battles all describe how rhythm becomes the framework of an army's march. The drumbeat travels farther than the human voice, even in the roar of the blizzard and the echoes of the valley. A document from the Big India expedition stated that the drummer's hands never stopped, even when frostbitten, because silence means collapse. Another one mentioned the use of horns and series, but it is the heartbeat of a drum, wooden animal skin, giving the shape of the footsteps. Then, of course, there are some strange details that give the texture. Chroniclers sometimes write that drummers stuffed straw or wool into the casings of their instruments to prevent them from cracking in the cold. There is a story about men roasting drumheads over fire every morning, taking the risk of cracking and getting burned, just to ensure that the drumheads do not sag in the damp air. Imagine this absurd scene. The frozen soldiers gathered around the fire, not for warmth but to keep their equipment alive. He written out. Prosperity, slow, steady and composed. The sound pierced through the wind. Forward. People instinctively keep in step, their steps syncing with the rhythm, so you feel your heartbeats starting to match. Your body is pulled by your pulse. The snow is still dragging your ankles. But the scorching heat dilutes the pain. It is a rope in the storm, a rope that binds you to the sound. Scholars who study this practice often hold different opinions on the extent to which the disciplined drum is truly implemented. Some people think that they have maintained order splendidly and avoided chaos, even when they weren't nearly blind. Others, however, believe that they offer more comfort than control. When the world turns white, they give men something familiar to rely on. Both sides recognize the psychological importance of rhythm. Even reluctant feet can be seen led forward by the drumbeat. The path wound its way down, and the snow immersed the echoes, so the beat sounded closer, almost intimate. You saw the figure of the drummer ahead, a boy under 16 years old. Hedge eeks where her hands roared, and she struck in a concentrated manner, looking more like a trance than a force. Every time he strikes the drumhead, it trembles, but he never misses the beat. When the soldiers passed by, they glanced at him and nodded slightly, as if he were the only one connecting the column. At night, the drum beats never fell. From time to time, they would be beaten more gently to mark the time within the camp. Every beat reminds people of order and routine, reminding them that there is something stable in the chaotic snow. You fall asleep to a deep, steady sound that is almost like a lullaby, but not everyone feels comfortable. A soldier complained that the drumbeat was too loud and went too far, telling the enemy where the camp was. Another one insists that the rhythm awakens the soul of the mountain, and every explosion is an insult that requires revenge. Fear and belief distort the sound, but the drumbeat continues, for without them, this line would vanish. You wake up before dawn, with frost stuck to your eyelashes, and it's back. Bang, bang, bang. It rolls in the valley like the pulse of the earth itself. You stood up, your shoulders aching, blisters forming on your feet, and you staggered along. Your body remembers the rhythm earlier than your brain. The march goes on and on, but the rhythm remains the same. It drowns out hunger. It masks the pain. It connects you with people in front of you and behind you. You can forget the faces of those around you, but you will never forget the drumbeats. This is the voice of survival, a voice that takes you through the mountains, determined to drive you away into silence. So you walked on, your boots creaking, your breathing quickening with each strike. The storm was still raging, but you were no longer the master. And strangely, you are very grateful. The further you go, the more you will notice that people rely not only on food, fire and rhythm, but also on faith. Believe in omens, believe in anything that suggests there is regularity in this mountain, rather than arbitrary cruelty. When survival is like flipping a coin, people start to seek patterns in every gust of wind and every ray of light. Chroniclers often document this practice. Soldiers tied amulets around their belts, wore Saint Medieval's around their necks, or hid small sacred objects in their pockets. However, beyond the official religion, the parade was filled with quieter and stranger rituals. Some people refused to step onto the frozen river first and wait for their companions to test the ice. Others spat into the snow before lying down, believing that this could soothe the ghosts living under the snow. None of these are written in the manual or the command. They are the whispered legends passed from one cold person to another. There are still some even more peculiar claims that have been passed down to this day. There is a story that soldiers refused to eat white food, milk, cheese, or even white bread in the storm because they were afraid that the snow would follow them in. Another article mentioned that someone was holding the feathers of crows, which were plucked from birds circling over the mountain peaks and were believed to have been used to prevent avalanches. Imagine an army trudging through, hungry and dragged, yet carefully grasping a black feather as if it were armor. You can see it right around you now. A soldier would stick a small wooden charm to his lip before each climb. Another person was whispering the same words every mile, his voice too low for others to hear. A group of people stopped and tied ribbons on the branches at the crossroads. The tokens fluttered in the wind, just like ghostly banners. None of these actions postponed the march. However, each one seems to be of vital importance, as if ignoring them would lead to disaster. Modern scholars are constantly debating how to take these superstitions seriously. Some people insist that they are at the core, uniting morale in ways that commanders cannot. Others, however, regard it as background noise, an embellishment in the chronicle, aiming to enhance the otherwise dull narrative. However, the existing evidence indicates that faith is not unimportant. People were frozen, starved to death and died, but they also wore almsgnomes and prayed in low voices to avoid inauspicious numbers. The boundary between faith and fear becomes blurred until they become the same. This mountain seems to have responded as well. Suddenly the wind rose, howling in the valley and making people make the sign of the cross in unison. A crow flew overhead, its wings exposed on the snow. The soldiers stopped to watch, and each of them had a different interpretation of this scene. Good luck, or merely a reminder, while they are trudging down, life is still freely moving up. You will realize how fragile rational thinking becomes when every step may end in silence. The story spread by the fire in the evening. A soldier swore that he saw a figure in white walking beside the column and vanished as soon as he turned his head. Another person insists that this mountain will take away men one by one until they are all paid off, and charm will only postpone debts. The laughter that followed was tense and too sharp, but it brought everyone together. Even fear can be a shared warmth. And listen to whispers. You looked at your hand, with a piece of cloth tied around your wrist. At first you didn't take it seriously, but now you find that you don't want to get rid of it. It is worn out and damp, and is of no use in any practical sense. But you still have to keep going, because in the deep mountains, when your breath freezes in your throat and stars disappear behind the clouds, sometimes even the tiniest superstition can make you feel as solid as a rock. The dawn came pale and merciless. The men slowly stood up, each with a captivating charm, muttering to themselves and following the rituals that seemed foolish during the day, but were indispensable. The parade continued. The steps are in harmony with the drumbeat. The eyes dashed towards the sky and the slopes. Look for signs. You know the mountains are indifferent. You know magic can't change the snow. But you also know that belief is warmth, and warmth is survival. So when you walk, half of it is faith and half is superstition. What is sacred is to believe that this mountain has rules for bargaining. Whether this is true or not, the act of believing is enough to make your legs move in the endless white. The team climbed up again, their boots crunching on the snow, as if there was no end. The man bent forward under the weight of his backpack. Their faces were sunken and their eyes were fixed only on the piece of land in front of them. If it weren't for the sounds coming from the storm, they would have wavered or even collapsed. The commander rode his horse close to the front line. His cloak crackled in the wind, and his words spread like sparks in the darkness throughout the column. He promised that what every soldier longed to hear was that there was warmth, food and victory beyond the pass. Contemporary records reveal how important such a declaration was. Leaders understand that cold, hunger and exhaustion consumed strength more quickly than any enemy's sword. So they gave the army hope. Charlemagne, Hannibal and countless unknown captains spoke of victory waiting behind the ridge, treasures in the valley below, or enemies trembling as they approached. Historians often record these speeches with a reverent heart, as if only words could enable people to climb over mountains. But at the edge of these same records, there are some less grand details hidden. A scribe wrote literature, but insisted on waiting for wine in the next village. Another person recalled that the officers told stories about warm baths and soft beds, woven things that could make the legs move. Imagine an army dragging its steps forward. What they dream of is not glory but simple comfort, a steaming loaf of bread and a leek miner's proof. The banner of conquest has shrunk into a whisper of survival. You can hear that voice now. This is a horse. It has split open due to the shouting over the past few days, but it can still penetrate the wind. Every breath the commander takes is depicting an illusion. A green valley overgrown with orchards. By town where the market stalls are filled with bread. In the village ablaze with flames, people are well minus fed. He swore that you lay nearby and one more ridge would come out. Although you know that the mountains stretch on and on. A part of you held on to the photo tightly. This is a story worth running around for. Historians still disagree on how effective these speeches were. They are indispensable. This is the only adhesive that keeps the military intact under such harsh conditions. Others believe that the soldiers frown and roll their eyes not because of their faith, but because they are afraid of punishment. Both viewpoints are correct. Some people, of course, move forward for victory. There are still people marching, because stopping means death. But everyone left. Maybe that's what the commander asked for. The column buzzed. A soldier beside you muttered that once the river valley comes, he'll drink up the water. Another person swore that he had